hear something. I hear something. Run! Run! You might have to be in the turret. I'm so upset. DC?
If you've been on the internet for more than 10 minutes in the past few months, you have very likely stumbled across the leviathan of indie horror that is Lethal Company. The game, released by Zeekers in October of 2023, has been a huge success, raking in millions of dollars since its release and is still going incredibly strong, which is amazing to see. Hi, I'm Danny, or Chase, or neither, and I absolutely love Lethal Company, just like everyone else on the internet seems to at this point. I mean, I've never had a game that has simultaneously scared me and also provided me with some of the funniest moments that any game in recent memory has given me. If you haven't experienced Lethal Company for yourself, whether playing it or watching it or just sitting by your friend while they play it, I mean, you are seriously missing out. But of course, as I've been playing and enjoying the game, there have been tons of questions swirling around in my head. Look, I know, leave it up to the philosophy major to overthink everything, cue laugh track, roll credits, whatever you want, but there are some serious, important conversations that I think Lethal Company as a work of cooperative horror fiction can genuinely start for us, which is why today we're talking about philosophy as it relates to the game Lethal Company. Before we begin, I think it's important to address something. Danny, Chase, neither. Can't we just enjoy the game for what it is and laugh at the funny orange men exploding? And to those of you asking this, I say, I mean, you chose to click on this video, so I don't really know what you want. Fiction, as an entire genre, is capable of delivering powerful messages that even work centered on real events sometimes can't match. In the spirit of sci-fi, consider the classic 1979 release Alien. On the surface, while this movie appears to be a thriller, horror, action movie, or as I prefer to call it, a thrillorction, if you take time to dive a bit deeper into the themes of the movie, you find a beautifully constructed metaphor about corporate greed, the struggles of working-class life, and the desire to own a flamethrower. Alright, that last one might just be me, but I don't think the first two are really that arguable. I mean, I could cite tons of sources that have already taken huge deep dives into this exact thing. I mean, on screen now are just two examples of the exact thing I just spoke about, and you can find both of them linked in the description if you want to learn more. So, how does any of this relate to Lethal Company? Lethal Company is another example of this thrillorction phenomenon, as I've taken to calling it, and while on the surface it appears to be this game about just these silly little guys collecting scrap and having their necks broken, if you take a minute to peek behind the curtain, I think you find something just a little bit deeper, which is why we're going to be taking a dive into that exact thing right now. So grab your flashlights and walkies and get in, losers, because we're going scrapping. That was terrible. Can you please cut that out? To start off with, I think there's a direct comparison we can quite easily make between the aforementioned Alien and Lethal Company: corporate greed. Lethal Company is a bit easier to explain and is also the main focus point of this video, so let's start by going over Alien. The scene that gets brought up the most when talking about Alien and corporate greed is the dinner scene. I can't play you the actual clip or else I might be sued to high heaven, but using my advanced knowledge of Adobe programs, I've made a pretty good recreation for us to follow along with. Essentially, the underlying message of the scene goes as follows. Look at the camaraderie, the smiles, the relaxed atmosphere. Everybody's having a good time until something shakes the entire foundation of the moment, the chestburster. A metaphor for greedy corporations which interrupts the party, having literally invaded and cut short the life of one of these people's friends, and now the rest of them are brought to face the grim reality that they all face. Lethal Company, as mentioned earlier, has a much clearer correlation to the concept of corporate greed. I mean, look at the name of the game. It's literally Lethal Company, and don't you worry, we'll be returning to the lethal part of that later, but for now, focus on company. In the game, you work for a mysterious corporation, the Company, that plunges you headlong into deadly moon bunkers and mansions for their own profit, and you are completely and utterly disposable to them in every possible sense. But here's a question that I think we need to chew on a little bit. Is the Company in Lethal Company actually the bad guy? Yes. I'm not going to sit around and BS my way through this video and pretend as if I know everything under the sun about business ethics, but I think we can all pretty confidently agree that if they had the chance, OSHA would have a field day with the company. I mean, just as one example, OSHA Standard 1903.13 states that having a workplace where your employees are constantly under the threat of imminent danger or death is generally not a good idea. But how do we know that the actions of the company are actually bad? I mean, sure, to the general population of the game, aka the players, it seems like the company's actions are less than favorable, but I mean, it's not like words like good and bad and right and wrong have any kind of objective basis, right? Nice segue, me. Before we can start talking about what makes something quote-unquote good or bad, there are a few terms we need to review: moral realism, moral anti-realism, and moral skepticism. A good portion of philosophers, at least most of the ones I know and chat with, lean towards moral realism, so we'll start there. Moral realism is the belief that our world contains objective facts relating to morality. In the same way that it's true that the sky is blue, a moral realist may claim that a statement such as murder is wrong is also true. To a moral realist, the word wrong is a description of a property of the action, the wrongness of the murder, in the same way that the sky is blue describes the blueness of the sky. This allows moral statements like murder is wrong or even murder is good to express themselves as propositions that may be true or false. Further, moral realists believe that some of these propositions are just true inherently, whether or not we agree with it. On the other hand, moral anti-realism is generally the belief that there are not any objectively true or false moral statements. To a moral anti-realist, the sky is blue is a different kind of sentence from murder is wrong. This is because they view moral claims as the kind of thing that just can't be objectively true. The sky is blue is what is known as a descriptive sentence. It's describing the way the world objectively is. Meanwhile, murder is wrong is a normative sentence. It's describing how things ought or ought not to be, i.e. you ought not murder. These are two very different types of sentences, and to the anti-realist, they aren't comparable when talking about objective truth. Now, it may very well be true that murder is wrong, says the anti-realist, but it won't be true as a property of murder or true independently of your mind. Kind of like the quote-unquote existence of things like dragons or leprechauns or France. Finally, we have moral skepticism. While moral anti-realists argue that moral statements are able to be true or false outside of being objective, a moral skeptic completely denies the existence of moral knowledge or justification for moral judgments. There are a decent variety of arguments for why skeptics believe this, but for our purposes, just know, skeptics do not believe that we can be knowledgeable in relation to morality. There are a wide variety of beliefs relating to morality as to why people believe moral realism, anti-realism, and skepticism, and we definitely don't have time to be getting into all of that. That's a video for another day entirely, but I think it's just important that we have these ideas and understandings going forwards because we're now going to be taking a look at some actual moral theories and applying them to Lethal Company, so that way we can actually determine whether or not the company is in fact the bad guy.
Duh.
We're going to be starting off with a pretty widely known and understood theory, one that definitely any intro to moral philosophy class would teach you: utilitarianism. If you saw my last video, then you know I spoke about the theory of hedonism, which is actually a pretty good stepping stone to understand the theory of utilitarianism. And if you didn't see my last video, then utilitarianism is a moral theory that states that a moral action is the one which brings about the greatest amount of pleasure and least amount of pain to those involved in the action. For example, if you hit somebody with your car, then you have brought them an immense amount of pain, and potentially even hurt your own self in the process, which then leads a utilitarian to say, don't just hit people with your car. And it isn't just physical pleasures and pains that are factored into the theory, it's all of the pleasures and pains you can think of. Because of all of this, utilitarianism is what's known as a consequentialist theory. The consequences of an action are what determine that action's moral value. In a very similar consequentialist theory, moral egoism takes exactly what utilitarianism says and strips it down to apply only to the thinker, the egoist themselves. I hit somebody with my car, but I didn't get hurt physically, mentally, emotionally, etc., so at the very least, this action doesn't seem to be immoral. In fact, they were in my way of getting to the bank on time, so I had to hit them, or else my self-interest would take a huge hit. Alright, the car hitting pedestrian example is a little bit on the extreme end of arguing for or against egoism and can kind of paint it in a bad light, but I think it paints a pretty clear picture as to how these theories work. I mean, utilitarianism is a bit more altruistic than egoism, but they both focus solely on the consequences, and keep in mind, every action you do has consequences, so
you best be ready for judgment.
One of the trickiest aspects to any consequentialist theory is just this inherent need to weigh the cost and benefit of any action that you ever do. I mean, sure, there are some examples that you can think of where a utilitarian, for example, would know how to act. Take the trolley problem, for instance. I mean, the utilitarian would 100% save the 5 people to minimize the damage done by killing the 1 person. But in cases that aren't that extreme, things start to get blurry really fast, which is what actually pushes people away from consequentialism and turns them to another type of theory, which is actually where we're going next. And brace yourselves, because we're talking about Immanuel Kant. More specifically, we're talking about a moral theory commonly attributed to Kant known as deontology. Deontology basically begins with the idea that there are obligatory moral rules that we must follow regardless of the effects or consequences that an action has on us. But how could you possibly know what these moral rules are? Well, let's take a nice look at every philosopher's best friend, the categorical imperative. I can feel the eyes rolling and hear the groans from here. Kant's idea of the categorical imperative essentially goes like this. You have a moral obligation to act according to the moral rule or principle that you wish all people would follow as if it were a universal law. What this does is prevent you from acting in a way that only you can, so something fairly selfish, for example, but also it prevents you from doing things that we think of as bad. Take lying, for instance. According to deontology, lying is bad in part because if we tried to make lying a universal rule, then you could never trust what a rational person would say to you because they could be lying. As it's been implied, deontology doesn't require you to weigh the costs and benefits of any consequence of an action at all, which actually comes as a very quick point against deontological theories, because, I mean, they don't care about the consequences of an action at all. So, as a famous example given by Immanuel Kant himself, imagine that there's a serial killer coming after your best friend, and that serial killer approaches you asking for information. Your best friend is hiding in your house, and you can very well lie to the serial killer and say, I don't know where they are. But Immanuel Kant says that this would still be the immoral thing to do because you've lied. Honestly, I can really respect that. He sticks to his guns and gives a great, spicy, philosophical take, which I definitely enjoy seeing. There are quite a few more theories that I could go into here, like contractualism, but this video isn't supposed to be crammed with nothing but morality, again, saving that for another day entirely. So let's take the theories that we talked about so far and move on to the applied part of this ethics lesson. Players of Lethal Company come face to face with countless moral conundrums during their explorations. Some of the most common include the following. Do I abandon my teammates to save myself? Is it wrong to leave my friend's body behind instead of hightailing it? Is it right to bash my friend's head in with a shovel or a stop sign in order to make quota? Let's use our new knowledge of the moral theories we just went over to try and determine what course of action you ought to take. First up, the easiest of the group, in my opinion, egoism. Would an egoist think it's alright to abandon your team? Yes. Okay, but also not really always. While it's true egoism is focused on, well, the ego, there are factors that could definitely play into an egoist's decision to or not to abandon their team. If they abandon their team, will they fail to make quota? If so, it's in their best self-interest to wait. If they abandon their team, will it save their own life and guarantee that they make quota? Then it's 100% the right thing to do to abandon the team. The exact same reasoning can be applied to the other two questions I raised as well. The safety of others is valued insofar as it progresses the egoist's self-interest. After all, morality applies to they and they alone and is solely focused on the consequences of themselves as such. No, I will never not be snarky to egoists. Next up is the utilitarian model working off of the egoists. For a utilitarian to agree to do any of the things I asked about, there would certainly need to be quite the good reason to do so. Perhaps if you knew that your entire team would be killed if they made it back to the ship and you were on your last day before making quota, this might be reason enough. Sacrifice them now to save all of you later. Makes sense. However, again, it really depends on how much weight is given to the actual act of abandoning your teammates. If you think abandoning your teammates acting in a semi-selfish way is worse morally than the alternative, then you'd have a reason to wait for them, even if it puts you and them all at risk. The same logic can be applied to the second question, but the third is where things start to get interesting. Is it wrong to kill to make quota? Remember, the only time a utilitarian will ever agree to kill somebody, in this situation or not, is solely if and only if it has the guarantee to maximize pleasure and reduce pain compared to the alternatives. And remember, this has to factor in the fact that a great deal of physical and mental pain will likely be given to the person who is killed, and also that their friends or family or loved ones and so on will be affected by it as well. It's actually that kind of chain reaction of who gets affected by what and how much that leads a lot of people to taking on deontological or other non-consequentialist beliefs. It just seems like these theories are too hefty to properly apply day to day. But this is just a game, so who cares? And speaking of non-consequentialism, deontology is up next. This is where things get a bit wishy-washy, as Immanuel Kant, funnily enough, never wrote about Lethal Company in a single one of his publishings, so take what I'm about to say with an extreme grain of salt. It's actually become a firm belief of mine, having taken however long to study this at this point, that deontology would have to say it is immoral to not recover the bodies of your teammates, abandon your teammates, and kill to make quota, which I know, boring, but I think the same logic follows from Immanuel Kant's own serial killer trying to kill your friend example. If you universalize abandoning your teammates, then you might run into situations where one teammate of yours is facing a life or death situation, and so they just up and leave the rest of you, which jeopardizes the entire point of the mission, and even if everything was going well, it's all just for a waste now. As for recovering bodies, you get penalized for not recovering bodies, so if you universalize the idea of not recovering bodies, then you're just penalizing yourself constantly, which doesn't seem to make any sense, even if there were deaths that your teammates couldn't avoid. Oh, and as for killing people, I don't think I have to tell you what would happen if you normalized murder for the sake of getting money. As I said, all of that is pure speculation on my part. I mean, Anyone who has ever read anything related to Kantian ethics will tell you how much of a complicated mess these theories are. And now that we have a kind of general understanding as to how these theories work, we can return to the original question. Is the company in Lethal Company actually the bad guy? And you better be going like this. Looking at consequentialist theories, it's very easy to argue that the company is the villain of Lethal Company. They hire people to send into dangerous and often deadly situations, all to make their money and take and take and take off of the backs of the laborers. If Jeremy Bentham were still around, he would shed a tear in solidarity with the scrappers. Deontology also has some choice words for the company, and those words are don't lie, don't cheat, and don't steal. We went over not lying earlier, and I'd say it's a pretty easy thing to prove that the company lies to, but also cheats and steals from the player all the time.
Your hard work is invaluable to the company.
Invaluable, eh? If that's the case, then why do you... Surprisingly, there is at least kind of an argument that you could put forward if you wanted the company to be seen as moral. At least, again, kind of. Major emphasis on kind of. There are definitely aspects of the company that you can look at to determine how just they are as a corporation. First, it's important to point out that the company doesn't discriminate with their hiring and firing practices. And that's about it. Also, if we suppose that the ones in charge of the company are ethical egoists or moral egoists, then it is very clear that they're acting in ways that to them maximize their pleasure and reduce their pain, and thus they're doing the most moral actions insofar as they apply to themselves. So if you work on the low end of the company, as we do in the game, then you likely see these people as the villains. But if you work in the high end of the company and see the world only through your lens, then congratulations, you're doing great work. As for you, I actually have a challenge for each of you before we move on to the next section. See, it's really easy to make an argument in favor of the players or against the company just by nature of the game. But I want all of you to try and make a proper argument that defends and supports the company in Lethal Company. And I don't want you to use any kind of egoism when you do it. That's why I went ahead and just did it. It's way too easy. And I want you to drop all of those takes down in the comments. I would love to see what you come up with. Anyway, that's all about morality. I swear we're done for now. Let's move on. Have you ever died? Let me answer that for likely more than 50% of you. No. As far as we know, the life we live right now is the only one we get. It is possible that there is something waiting for all of us after death, but we can't truly be sure of that. But something that Lethal Company made me think about that I had never thought about before, when we die, what if we just come back, waking up on the floor of our bedrooms and moving on as if nothing happened? Okay, that sounds really silly, but it's still technically not 100% impossible. But this does actually lead me to the direction of thinking about something that I've had stuck in my head for a few days now. See, when you die in Lethal Company, do you play as the same person just brought back to life, or do you play as a replacement brought in to fill the spot that you left when your last character died? There's evidence that I think exists arguing in both favors of this, so let's go over the facts. Death in Lethal Company is expected. Why else would the game be called Lethal Company? See, I told you we'd be getting back to it. But what are the actual ramifications of death in this universe? To most players, it seems like when you die, you just kind of come back. You lose a bit of money, but you also just wake up in the ship again ready to charge back into action as if nothing happened. But is this actually the same you that you were when you died? Sure, you're still seeing through their eyes, they're wearing the exact same outfit you were, and they have the same rank and experience level as you did. All kinds of stuff like that, which could lead you to conclude that yes, it is in fact the same person. But pushing against this idea, when you die, you lose all of your stuff. Anything in your inventory is gone. More than that, when all of the team dies, the ship you respawn in is completely empty. You lose all of your scrap. Could it be a completely new ship with a completely new crew? But DCN, I hear you cry. That's what you sound like. When your whole team dies, the days left count is the same, and you have the same quota. In response to this, I could make the argument that it's simply a new crew being given the tasks left unfinished by your original crew that died. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. This is just me reaching for the sake of argument with strangers on the internet in hopes to earn some kind of fun internet points. And yes, fine, you got me, but I do have an actually pretty interesting direction to take this, and it starts with me asking, well, if it is in fact the same person that you play as when you respawn, what does that say about the state of existence for any character in this universe? Before diving in, it's important that I let you all know I don't know anything about the lore of this game. I specifically wanted to avoid diving deep into it, just so I could write something as out there as I wanted, and hell, maybe even just walk into the truth. So everything I'm about to say is purely just speculation on my part. If the crewmates in Lethal Company are incapable of dying, or at the very least they can die but are always brought back to life, then it can certainly be argued that the lives of these people has become fairly pointless if it ever had a purpose to begin with. They live every day just to die by the hands of another horrific monster or fall to their death or something, all to just try and sell scrap to a company that doesn't seem to care a thing about them. This is truly a horrific state of affairs. A state summed up perfectly by the philosopher Albert Camus when he ushered in his idea of absurdity. Absurdism is a belief that the universe is inherently meaningless as well as irrational. There's no way to truly understand a thing within or about the universe, and trying to do so will lead you into serious conflict. So what are you supposed to do? Do you just go insane and let the coldness of the universe take over as you slowly rot away? According to the aforementioned father of absurdism, Albert Camus, there are actually a few things you can do in response to this claim. One of Camus' responses would likely get this video targeted by YouTube, and the other is a little hard to explain in a broad sense, so I'll just tell you what Camus said was the only defensible response: embracing absurdity. Essentially, each of us, if we live in a meaningless universe, have a kind of duty to design our own meaning and purpose and live as if we actually have it. That way, in an otherwise uncaring universe, we can still at least feel like we have some kind of purpose. If you acknowledge the absurd nature of the universe, that being no inherent meaning being found in it at all, but you continue to search for that inherent meaning, then you can actually live a very happy, meaningful life, says Albert Camus, because you've developed meaning from the search itself. Or, put more eloquently by Camus himself in his work The Myth of Sisyphus, the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. In Lethal Company, I think we see this exact belief put into practice beautifully. Think of what this game is on its own. You go into a building, pick things up, bring it to a ship, and that's it. It's repetitive, monotonous, sometimes scary, but it just loops over and over again. So what's special about Lethal Company? What makes it fun? What's the purpose or point of playing this game at all?
Well, you know how to play this game more than me. I know the general thing, but as I said, I've only played this by myself.
So then I will have to... DC, don't do it. DC, don't do it. Don't do it.
Okay, is there... Oh.
There you are.
Okay, that's you good. No! Oh, no! Why would you do that?
We play this game because we want the experience, the camaraderie. Remember how I said this game has made me laugh like no other game in a long time? That's exactly why I think most of us play this game. This isn't a dig or a stab at the game or anything, but it feels like playing this game solo is a completely different experience than playing it with other people. I mean, after all, it feels like this game was designed to be played with other people. Proximity chat, the walkie-talkies, and all kinds of stuff like that, not even mentioning the Steam Award that it won. Sure, you are totally free to just meet quota over and over again playing on your own, but it really feels like when you do that, you're missing one of the biggest experiences that this game has to offer, the biggest reason to play this game at all. You just kind of fall into this monotony, this absurd state of affairs that just makes the game kind of a bust after a while. Alright, we need to move on, but before we do, there's actually a really good video that I watched the other day about the solo experience of playing Lethal Company. I'll link it in the description, and I really hope you go and give it a watch, but other than that, that's all of my rambles on absurdism. Am I maybe looking a bit too deep into this game? Probably, but am I having fun while doing it? Absolutely. Anyway, let's move on. What does it mean to be you? If you died and had your consciousness transferred to another body, is that new body you? Is a body a part of us at all in the first place? Hell, when you play a video game, is the character you play as and world you play in some kind of piece of you now, extended outward into a digital space? That latter question probably sounds absolutely insane. How could a fictional digital character be an extension of somebody's physical self into a game world? What next? I'll tell you that it's not the heat that gets you, it's the humidity. The idea of the self is very interesting. See, the idea of myself is different from the idea of yourself. To you, I am just another example of a yourself, but to me, and only me, I am a myself. That means that each of us is blessed, cursed, blessed with some kind of unique knowledge. The unique knowledge of the experience of what it is to be yourself. The self is often referenced to and defined in the first person: I, me, my, so on. In essence, the self is able to identify what's referred to as mental qualia, subjective and conscious experience. Most philosophers agree that in the third person, you can't really get the idea of someone's mental qualia unless they directly express it to you themselves. If I refer to me, then I am referring to myself. If you refer to me, you don't say me or I, you say you, and vice versa. That much is obvious. However, what does it actually mean to be a me, a self? Well, a bunch of philosophers have had a bunch of different ideas as to what it could possibly mean, so let's go over a few. Aristotle, aka Plato but not as cool, don't at me, believed that the self was something inseparable from a body, but also a core component of said body. Think of this as Aristotle thinking of the self in terms of a soul, which had an immortal intellect that guides the very being it resides in. The most used example of what this means is, if a knife were to have a soul, to Aristotle that means the act of cutting is that soul. This soul also comes in multiple pieces, each one responsible for different things, whether logical, rational activities or irrational and need-driven activities. For a more modern example of a theory of the self, Scotsman David Hume argued that the self, the soul, is a bundle of perceptions that act very fluid and constantly change and succeed each other. Essentially, the self is made up of not some kind of core substance, but by a bunch of different yet related dynamic pieces. Hume himself was actually not a huge fan of his own definition of the soul or self, but he never managed to go back and fix it, so what can you do? It's what he said. Both of the theories that we just went over kind of imply that the self, the soul, is this kind of thing that exists in the world. Sure, you might not be able to cut someone open and find it, but it does exist somewhere in there. But there are actually quite a few contemporary philosophers that don't seem to agree that the self is actually a thing at all. The American philosopher Daniel Dennett believes that the idea of the self is less an actual substance or thing and more like a temporarily existing fictitious idea. Think about the idea of an object's center of gravity, a hypothetical point of an object used to aid physicists in calculating whatever it is that they're doing. The self, to Dennett, works the same way, not referring to anything or anyone tangibly, but to a kind of character made up by each of us. Finally, the philosopher Aaron Sloman argues that the self is even less than a made-up character and is just a label that we use to avoid having to inconvenience ourselves by saying the name of whoever we're referring to whenever we speak. Whenever I say I, that's just an easy way to avoid saying Danny or Chase or neither every time. So what does any of this have to do with the funny neck-break monster game? Well, how far out does the self go? Many people may say that the self only extends as far out as their skin will allow, but if that's the case, then if somebody has a prosthetic body part, is that not a part of themselves? I mean, the idea of the self is truly the most relatable form of the ship of Theseus that we could ever experience, and we do experience it every day. How much of you do you need to keep to, in fact, remain yourself, if such a quantity exists? Maybe the self is something immeasurable. There is no, if you get rid of X amount of yourself, then you're no longer you. The self is simply something that resides in us by necessity, whether that necessity is a quality of our individual selves, or something that makes up our foundation as a being, or maybe something that just actually doesn't exist at all unless we need it to. The point I'm getting at here is one I brought up at the start of this section. Does the self extend outward into our environment more than we may realize? If you hold a controller, for example, is said controller now said to be a part of yourself? If you're quick to say, no, that's absolutely ridiculous, then think about the fact that when you hold an object, you're allowed to say that you have the quality of holding that object in your hand, or wherever you're holding it, for the duration that you hold it. So I now have the quality of holding this controller in my hand. So I'm not saying that the controller becomes a part of your body or anything like that, but it may very well become a part of yourself. I find it quite interesting that if you respond with no to this as well, that if you were to play Lethal Company and have another player refer to you as you, or perhaps even by your name, you would respond to such a thing. If this character was not in some way connected to yourself, then why would you react in any way to being referred to as you? If you're going to say the you they're referring to is the character in which I am simply in control of, not part of myself, could it not be the case that this character you're in control of is a digital extension of yourself out into the cyberspace that is the internet, which is what we've been implying this whole time? Think about the fact that you communicate through this digital being. You speak or use text chat. You use this being to communicate to others doing the same thing. You try to accomplish some task with an end goal inside and outside of the game, meeting quotas and having fun, hopefully. I see it as somewhat plausible that in order for this game to give us the fun we desire, our idea of the self shifts and morphs into encompassing this digital being, at least for the moments in which we're in control of it. When I play this game with other people, and they refer to me as Danny or Chase or whatever, they're not referring to the character, they're referring to me, this nameless, faceless thing I'm in control of, as just a kind of vessel. They're asking me to do things, they're asking me to go and get something, or they're telling me to go do something. I see one plausible explanation of this being that, well, yes, when you take control of a character in a video game, that character becomes a part of your actual self. Now, one of the more challenging parts of this whole thing to rationalize is the concept of death in the game. When you die in Lethal Company, it's not actually you that's died, it's your character that now just seems to be kind of not moving anymore. I guess I could argue that this is just kind of another way of saying that your character has become inoperable and you haven't actually died, but that starts to get a little bit hazy and is kind of hard to really prove. So I'm not too sure what to say about that. This is all completely pure speculation on my part, by the way. I'm not saying that you have to believe everything I tell you because I'm telling you. I could very well be wrong about a lot of this stuff. What are your takes on the self? Is the self something that actually exists, or does it not? What is the self and what isn't the self? If you have any kind of take on that, I would love to see it down below in the comments. Go ahead and drop all of them there. I'll be sure to read them. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough in this video, so let's move on to the outro. And we have come to the end of another video. I have been rambling for a while now, so I think it's your turn to take over a bit of the talking for a while. Down below, I want to hear all of your Lethal Company hot takes, and heck, just your philosophical hot takes in general too. Drop them down in the comments and I'll be sure to read each of them. And also, while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and stay ready for future uploads. Maybe we'll run into each other in-game one of these days, or heck, maybe one of these days I'll make a video or do a stream where I actually just sit down and play with you guys in Lethal Company for a little bit. If that's something that you'd like, be sure to let me know. I'm definitely interested in pursuing that if it's something you guys want. But other than that, I'm DannyChase, and I guess I'll be seeing you in the next video. Bye now. Hi, I'm Danny, or Chase, or neither, and if you haven't... that's not the line. I am 2 seconds into this video and I fucked it up. Alright. Before we begin, I think... oh, yeah. While on its surface it appears to just be a silly little scary game about guys getting their necks broken and collecting scrap, that's not the right order. I need to do the funny. To start off with, I think there's a direct comparison we can quite easily make between the aforementioned Alien and Lethal Company. Corporate greed. Oh my god. Do over. Essentially, the underlying message of the scene goes as follows. Look at the camaraderie, the smiles, the relaxed atmosphere. Everybody's having a good time until something shakes the entire foundation of the moment. The chestburster, a metaphor for greedy corporations, and fuck. I'm not gonna sit here and try and BS my way through understanding everything under the sun about business ethics. I'm not gonna try and sit here and just BS my way through all of this and pretend I know everything under the sun about business ethics. Why is that so hard for me to say? But how do we know that the actions of the... bleh. These are two very different types of sentences, and to the anti-realist, they are not comparable. Oh god. As I mentioned before, deontology doesn't care about the... and is it right to bash my... It's actually become a firm belief of mine that deontology would have to say that it is immoral to... what the fuck are the things? I forgot. It is immoral to abandon your teammates. Whatever the other one was. More than that, when all of the team dies, the ship you respawn is put more eloquently by Albert Camus in his... Think about the idea of an object's center of gravity. It's a hypothetical point used to